Welcome to some very famous people you've never really heard of. Bite-sized biographies of the famous, the infamous, and the quirky in less than an hour. My name is Philip D. Gibbons, and there is more information about me, this podcast, and a bibliography at bitesizebiographies.com. There are also photographs of many of the individuals and items mentioned in this podcast. At the conclusion of part one of this presentation, there will be additional suggestions concerning further information about today's subject, F. Scott Fitzgerald. If you have enjoyed this presentation, please like us at our Facebook page, Bite Size Biographies. Subscribe to my YouTube page at Noblesse Oblige. Please note that all of Bite Size Biographies are now available on Spotify. And please tell a friend about Bite-Sized Biographies. Now let's get started with our story about F. Scott Fitzgerald. In September of 1919, a 23-year-old aspiring writer known as Scott Fitzgerald was living in his parents' attic in the family home in St. Paul, Minnesota. Fitzgerald's previous few years were both traumatic and difficult. In 1917, he left Princeton as a junior to enlist in the Army during World War I. He was on the verge of expulsion, on academic probation, and also devastated by a recent romantic rejection from a wealthy socialite. Fitzgerald as upset over his lack of economic status as much as his emotional trauma. While stationed in Montgomery, Alabama, Fitzgerald met another prominent debutante named Zelda Sayre, and they immediately began a relationship that, although serious, centered again on Scott's lack of any substantive economic or social standing. Leaving the Army in February 1919, Fitzgerald moved to New York City, where he was able to get a copywriting job at an ad agency. He continued a long-distance relationship with Zelda, and for a few months they were informally engaged. But his tiny salary and penurious existence in New York, with little prospects for financial success, prompted Zelda to break off the engagement. Again, completely depressed and loathing his mundane advertising employment, in July 1919, Fitzgerald quit and moved back home to St. Paul. Fitzgerald still had literary ambitions. He had actually sold a short story during his brief New York tenure. And he also had a novel, although twice rejected by the prestigious publishing house Scribner's, which he wanted to revise. Fitzgerald was encouraged by a young Scribner's editor named Max Perkins, who not only supplied him with specific advice for revisions, but also motivated him to keep submitting his work. The writer, a heavy drinker during his days at Princeton and in New York, focused intensely on a third revision of the manuscript and abstained from alcohol. In early September 1919, he submitted the manuscript entitled This Side of Paradise, an autobiographical work involving both romance, social commentary, and undergraduate life that was already notorious within the upper echelon of Scribner's senior staff as shallow and unliterary, not worthy of their prestigious imprint. Although accounts differ, it definitely took Max Perkins' relentless advocacy to get Scribner's to accept the book for publication. Perkins wrote a personal letter of acceptance to Fitzgerald, and the author still remembered many years later the euphoria he experienced after this life-altering moment. Suddenly, everything changed with that first wild wind of success and the delicious mist it brings with it. It is short and precious time, for when the mist rises in a few weeks or a few months, one finds that the very best is over. Over time, Fitzgerald probably realized that he was referring to not only his literary career, but his life itself. Francis Scott Key Fitzgerald was born in St. Paul on September 24th, 1896, and named for the author of The Star-Spangled Banner, a distant relative. At the time of Scott's, as he came to be known, birth, his father, Edward Fitzgerald, was running a furniture store in St. Paul most likely bankrolled by the St. Paul family of Scott's mother, Mary Molly McQuillan Fitzgerald. Molly's father was quite wealthy as a result of making a fortune in the grocery business, and Edward Fitzgerald moved to St. Paul with his wife, most likely to take advantage of a business opportunity involving the sale and manufacture of wicker furniture. Whether this business failed or the losses became untenable, Edward Fitzgerald shut down the business in 1897 and moved his family to Buffalo, where he took a job as a salesman for Procter & Gamble. F. Scott Fitzgerald's two female siblings died in an epidemic shortly before his birth, and despite the eventual arrival of another sister, Scott was the only son and was completely overindulged by his mother in a manner which her son came to resent. Well into adolescence, Scott remained overly sensitive and insecure socially, traits that shaped his adult life. This outlook was not helped by his father's abrupt termination from Procter & Gamble in 1908. Edward Fitzgerald, now unemployed at 55 years of age. Having already depleted a great deal of the McQuillan assets, the Fitzgerald family would move back to St. Paul, where they lived in a social limbo, well-connected but no longer wealthy. Molly was determined to maintain certain standards, and she enrolled Scott first in an all-boys Catholic school, and after her son underachieved, sent him to a Catholic boarding school in New Jersey, the Newman School. There he did better academically, well enough to be admitted to Princeton. The Fitzgerald family also caught a break in 1913 when Scott's maternal grandmother passed away, leaving Molly $125,000, the 2026 equivalent of over $4 million. So for her eldest son, it was off to old Nassau. He immediately ran into academic trouble, focusing his time on submissions to the various campus publications, trying out for the football team, a one-day fantasy, and interacting with the Triangle Club, a campus undergraduate group that wrote and performed musical comedy. If he needed to cut class, so be it. This attitude prompted poor or even failing grades, and by Fitzgerald's junior year, he was academically ineligible to even be in the Triangle Club, despite still participating in the group's activities. He continued to neglect his studies, and by the end of the first semester junior year, with exams approaching that he was sure to fail, Fitzgerald withdrew from school, ostensibly on account of illness, a touch of malaria. Fitzgerald was also struggling with a romantic relationship that ultimately became emotionally shattering. On winter break of his sophomore year, Fitzgerald met 16-year-old Ginevra King at a St. Paul party hosted by one of her Westover School classmates. Ginevra came from a very wealthy Chicago family, and realistically, even if she was completely smitten, there was virtually zero chance that her parents would ever agree to a marriage to such a middle-class, short-pocketed suitor like Fitzgerald. But her boarding school location in Middlebury, Connecticut, allowed Fitzgerald to pursue a long-distance relationship of sorts. The occasional visit by train and a steady stream of romantic letters which certainly flattered his teenage flame. Unfortunately for Fitzgerald, he was not Ginevra's only suitor. Other more socially suitable individuals, either urged on by her parents or situated much closer at Yale, also pursued her romantically. Although they frequently corresponded by letter, Fitzgerald's actual physical proximity to Ginevra were a couple of Ivy League football games, a few parties, a trip to New York, and several trips to Westover. Ginevra's coquettish attitude was demonstrated by her eventual expulsion from Westover for the violation of flirting with boys from her dorm room window. Although the school eventually agreed to readmit her, her father, outraged by what he considered to be a slight, arranged to send her to a New York boarding school instead. In the meantime, in August of 1916, Fitzgerald visited the King's summer residence in Lake Forest, Illinois, the Tony suburb where many wealthy Chicago residents spent the summer. This was the first time that Fitzgerald was in the proximity of Ginevra's parents, her father practically interrogating him about his background and financial prospects. Also present was Bill Mitchell, the son of King's business partner in the oil and financial industries, the younger Mitchell clearly in the running as a much more realistic romantic prospect. That Fitzgerald was also an Irish Catholic in an atmosphere dominated by much wealthier WASPs was an additional impediment to any kind of acceptance, and in fact, some accounts have her father kicking him out of the house. But not before allegedly bellowing loud enough in a conversation for all to hear, "Poor boys should not think of marrying rich girls." Although probably an overly dramatic and false anecdote, there was no question how Ginevra's parents felt, and within several months, in January of 1917, Ginevra officially kicked Scott to the curb, crushed and now realizing that their formerly passionate letters might now be quite embarrassing. He formally requested that she destroy any and all of his correspondence. She coldly responded by saying that she had already destroyed them and never thought that they meant anything anyway. And by the way, could you please destroy my letters to you? Fitzgerald did destroy the originals, but not before assembling a 200-plus page typed and bound transcription, technically complying with Ginevra's wishes. This material ultimately became useful to flesh out some of Fitzgerald's most famous characters, his depictions practically literal recreations stemming from his own experiences. But it also underlined what was a romantic obsession that never really left F. Scott Fitzgerald for the rest of his life. Disconsolate, Fitzgerald also had to face the reality of his situation at Princeton. Entering what should have been the second semester of his junior year, he was told by the administration that he would have to repeat the year entirely, having failed so many courses. Also having withdrawn from the first semester when he returned in January 1917 and facing the prospect of flunking out entirely, he was able to take advantage of a policy that allowed any student beginning comprehensive military training to get credit for any current academic coursework upon focusing on preparing for the armed forces. This before the inevitable American entry into World War I, which occurred formally in April of 1917. Fitzgerald signed up for and completed such preparation in May of 1917 and did receive the appropriate academic credit. He whiled away most of the summer in St. Paul writing poetry, reading highbrow philosophy and literature, and drinking gin. In October of 1917, he showed up to officers' training school at Fort Leavenworth as a second lieutenant and then bounced around various military outposts before, in June of 1918, landing at Camp Sheridan near Montgomery, Alabama. Presuming that he would be killed in battle, he had quickly batted out in about 3 months a 120,000-word novel that he entitled The Romantic Egotist. Through a Princeton connection and writer published by Scribner's, Shane Leslie, the manuscript made its way to the esteemed publishing house on May 6, 1918. It would be rejected twice, first in August and again after a revision in October, both times by a young editor named Maxwell Perkins, who nevertheless encouraged Fitzgerald to keep revising. As if professional rejection wasn't enough, in July of 1918, Fitzgerald wrote to Ginevra King in an attempt to rekindle or even reestablish some kind of relationship. She replied by writing back with the wonderful news that she was engaged to surprise Bill Mitchell, the business partner's son that Fitzgerald encountered at the King home in Lake Forest. Ginevra gushed, "To say I am the happiest girl on earth would be expressing it mildly. I wish you knew Bill so that you could know how very lucky I am." Although Fitzgerald probably wanted to slit his wrists, he sent her a handwritten note of congratulations. King actually invited him to this September 4th wedding, but supposedly his military assignment precluded his participation. However, Fitzgerald did keep the invitation. Newspaper clippings from the Chicago Tribune, and even a swath of one of Ginevra's handkerchiefs in his voluminous scrapbook with the inscription, "The End of a Once Poignant Story." In what may be one of the most prominent rebound romances in literary history, in the summer of 1918, Fitzgerald began romancing another high-profile socialite native of Montgomery, Zelda Sayre. Only a month out of high school when he met her, she was socially prominent, but her family was not as wealthy as Ginevra King. Strikingly attractive and outgoing, she was the object of a great deal of attention from several Army pilots, the type of competition that would have inspired Fitzgerald to pursue her out of a sense of competition. Only days after Ginevra's September wedding, Scott and Zelda became a serious couple. The military briefly intruded on the relationship in October of 1918, sending Fitzgerald to Camp Mills at Long Island in preparation for transport to frontline combat in France. But in early November, an armistice was declared and Fitzgerald was ordered back to Montgomery and Zelda. He pressed her for a formal engagement, revealing his plans to relocate to New York City to pursue a writing career in journalism or advertising. Zelda hedged her bets. She would stay in Montgomery until Fitzgerald demonstrated that he could establish the type of livelihood that could support a married couple. Scott headed off to the Northeast on his own, more than a little put off. Discharged from the Army, Scott spent the spring of 1919 attempting to find a job with a newspaper. Unsuccessful, he ultimately wound up at an ad agency composing short copy for streetcar advertisements. Writing daily to Zelda to convince her to move to New York, she responded only occasionally, and Scott knew that she was also seeing other men. He made several trips to Montgomery to try and convince her to marry him. By June, she had officially broken off even a quasi-engagement. Disconsolate, Scott returned to New York and quit his job, his plan to move back into his parents' house in St. Paul, intent on one final stab at getting his novel revised and published. His parents were not crazy about the idea, but they tolerated his presence, drawing the line at an allowance. Fitzgerald had zero social life, abstained from alcohol, and focused solely on his novel revision. This isolated existence, probably dictated by economic necessity as much as anything else. He also was not even corresponding with Zelda. Finishing the third revision of The Romantic Egoist, now entitled This Side of Paradise, in September 1919, he sent it off to Perkins at Scribner's and hoped for the best, so broke and his writing career hanging by a thread that he got a menial job at the Northern Pacific Railroad car barns fixing railroad cars. Although most of the Scribner's editorial board was still not enthusiastic, it took Max Perkins' threats to quit the firm to finally get the publisher to accept This Side of Paradise. However, there was no advance, and the book would not even appear in print until early 1920. But the prestige of having an imminent novel from the likes of Scribner's allowed Fitzgerald to sell several short stories. By February of 1920, he sold fiction to the Saturday Evening Post, a major step forward. He also acquired an agent, Harold Ober, of the top-flight firm Paul, Revere, and Reynolds. In November of 1919, he traveled to New York and personally met with both Ober and Max Perkins. The latter, although 12 years older than Fitzgerald, was still only 35 years old. He then headed to Montgomery and a rapprochement with Zelda. She did not make any formal commitments, but things warmed up, and upon Fitzgerald's return to St. Paul, romantic letters were again reciprocated. He also began to regularly crank out short stories. 6 published in the Saturday Afternoon Post between November 1919 and February 2020, including Bernice Bobs Her Hair, which got Scott his first appearance on the cover of the magazine. By January of 1920, Fitzgerald was living in New Orleans, supposedly to avoid tuberculosis, but more likely to be within striking distance of Zelda. This attention paid off. The couple were formally engaged, although a public announcement did not appear in the Montgomery newspapers until March 28th, only 6 days before the actual ceremony at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City. There were only 8 guests present, and none of the bride and groom's parents. This Side of Paradise was published a week earlier, on March 26th, 1920. Scribner's produced a first printing of 3,000 copies, a modest number for a first novelist. This edition sold out in 3 days. The contemporary tale of a young man of great ambition and his descriptions of his romantic relationships and academic life were especially popular with younger readers. the book considered stylishly rebellious and stylistically inventive. It did not hurt that Fitzgerald himself was only 23, good-looking, impeccably dressed, and fabulously photogenic. Reviews were generally good. Any negativity from stodgier members of the literary press only served to reinforce the novel as innovative and avant-garde. Fitzgerald and Zelda quickly became high-profile celebrities, their antics including jumping fully clothed into various landmark New York fountains, table stomping in popular watering holes, and non-stop revelry that got them kicked out of the Biltmore and Commodore hotels, other guests not amused. Such activity was typically fueled by excessive amounts of alcohol, which eventually reduced Fitzgerald's behavior to bordering on annoyingly childlike. Such aimlessness continued throughout the spring of 1920, Fitzgerald taking several trips to Princeton, where he wasn't particularly welcome, and then returning to New York, he and his wife continuing to enjoy their celebrity and the city's nightlife. Realizing that in this environment he would never be able to focus on the inevitable second novel, Scott rented a farmhouse in Westport, Connecticut, on Long Island Sound. An inveterate planner, he listed a novel, story, and play as his literary objectives by October 16th. It didn't happen. A 2-week trip back to Montgomery, weekends spent partying with a house full of New York literary types, and frequent trips to the city still remained a distraction. October only brought a relocation back to Manhattan and an apartment on what is today Central Park South, conveniently near the Plaza Hotel, where the couple dined frequently. As a result of the success of Paradise, in September 1920, Scribner's released a collection of Fitzgerald's short stories, a not atypical marketing strategy, and not affected by the author's lack of production. The 8 stories already previously written and published in magazines. This book was also commercially successful, selling over 15,000 copies and 6 editions in 2 years, an impressive amount for a collection of short stories. Eventually, in late 1920, Fitzgerald did hunker down and began work on his next novel. In February 1921, mundane marital reality intruded when Zelda became pregnant. The Fitzgeralds were already considering a European excursion, and this development hastened the trip. Fitzgerald was finished with his second novel by April and dropped it off with Harold Ober before heading to Europe. Deemed a research project for fictional material, the couple sailed first class on Cunard's Aquitania, landing in Great Britain on May 10th. Scribner's arranged social events with the likes of John Galsworthy and the Winston Churchills. Shane Leslie also played host, possibly a little stunned by Fitzgerald's sudden success. Scott and Zelda then traveled to Paris, Rome, Florence, and Venice. By the end of June, the couple was back in London, shortly after the release of This Side of Paradise in Great Britain. The book did not do well, either commercially or critically. College life and romance probably a bit too alien for both the British public and literary establishment. The Fitzgeralds canceled plans for an extended stay and headed back to the U.S. In Scott's absence, Harold Ober sold the serial rights for Fitzgerald's second novel, entitled The Beautiful and the Damned, to Metropolitan Magazine, another of the numerous New York literary-based magazines of the time period. This version was shortened by the magazine's editors by 40,000 words. After another brief visit to Montgomery, limited by the heat, it was decided that the couple would head for St. Paul, where Zelda would give birth and Scott would revise the proofs of The Beautiful and the Damned. He would also revel in his status as a high-profile published celebrity novelist, interviewed by all of the local papers, and even appearing at a few speaking engagements despite his aversion to public speaking. Scott and Zelda's daughter, Frances Scott Fitzgerald, was born in a St. Paul hospital on October 26, 1921. The Fitzgeralds rented a house and chose to remain in Minnesota. Despite Zelda's difficulty with the cold, the couple wanted to be close to family. During this time period, Fitzgerald composed one of his most famous short stories, The Diamond as Big as the Ritz, a very unusual for the time fable and commentary on wealth and the Wild West. Way too cutting edge for the more prominent American literary magazines, Harold Ober was only able to get $300 from the H.L. Mencken-affiliated Smart Set magazine. Meanwhile, Fitzgerald was greatly anticipating the publication of The Beautiful and the Damned, so the Fitzgeralds relocated to New York City to observe the publishing world's reaction. Another theory concerned the possibility that Zelda was in need of an abortion, not wanting another infant so quickly after the birth of her first child. With this side of paradise setting a high bar, Fitzgerald was going to have to provide a spectacular effort to meet critical and popular expectations. Scribner's was also optimistic with a first run of 20,000 copies. Unlike his novel, which dealt with college-age challenges, romance amidst the merriment of the early 20s, The Beautiful and the Damned was a book that discussed more adult themes about a married couple that greatly resembled the Fitzgeralds and the difficulties they faced, including alcoholism, financial irresponsibility, and aimlessness. A major theme is the moral decline that occurs as a result of great wealth, a concept that Fitzgerald would examine in future works. The actual plot concludes with the couple legally regaining an inheritance, but after years of poverty and alcohol abuse, they are shells of their former selves. While critics did like what they perceived as Fitzgerald's literary progress, the unexpectedly stark contrast and depressing story resulted in overall ambivalence. One review that eventually generated a great deal of historical significance was a satirical piece written by Zelda Fitzgerald for the New York Tribune entitled Friend's Husband's Latest. Although completely tongue-in-cheek, she pokes fun at her husband's pretentiousness and even implies that passages of the book were plagiarized from her diary. This has prompted scholars to infer that Scott and Zelda actually collaborated or that he merely copied some of her already written prose. This tidbit foreshadowed the eventual competitive nature of the Fitzgeralds' relationship, a competition that had severely negative consequences. Nevertheless, the book generated sales of approximately 50,000 copies and appeared on the bestseller lists early in 1922. Fitzgerald made about $15,000 in straight royalties, as well as another $7,000 for the magazine's serial rights. Royalties during this time period were only paid on hardcover book sales. There was no paperback market, which did not become an industry standard until the late 40s, and the Book of the Month Club did not even exist. This was a good payday, but considering the couple's lavish lifestyle and irresponsibility with money, Fitzgerald was obliged to continue with short pieces sold to the magazine marketplace. He did attempt to compose a play, The Vegetable, which went nowhere, and various plot summaries for motion picture producers like David O. Selznick, but these also were rejected or not produced. 1922 was not a particularly productive year. The Fitzgeralds summered at the White Bear Yacht Club in Delwood, Minnesota, near St. Paul. Scott assembled another collection of short stories entitled Tales of the Jazz Age, which contained well-known stories, including The Diamond as Big as the Ritz, as well as previously unpublished material. It was reasonably well received and sold out 3 editions. In August, Scott and Zelda were kicked out of the yacht club as their raucous parties became an annoyance to other club members. The couple, by now bored with their bucolic environment, willingly headed back to New York. They rented a spacious home in Great Neck, an upscale suburban enclave which featured numerous entertainment personalities ranging from Eddie Cantor to Ring Lardner. Only minutes away from Manhattan, on the north shore of Long Island, this locale provided the setting for what became Fitzgerald's third and most famous novel. However, it would be several months before he began to focus on composing this work, instead spending a great deal of time carousing with Ring Lardner, also a heavy drinker. A great deal of silent film production was still underway in the New York area, with many film industry production executives living in Great Neck. Fitzgerald once again attempted to make some inroads with both the composition of original story ideas as well as marketing his short stories and novels. The rights to This Side of Paradise were sold for $10,000 to the famous player's Lasky studio, the eventual Paramount Pictures, helmed by the legendary Adolph Zukor. Scott was also slated to receive an additional $2,500 for assembling the storyline for the prospective film, but the project was quickly dropped by the studio. There was no indication as to why this happened, especially after such a large rights fee was paid. So it is not possible to determine if Fitzgerald's difficulty with converting fiction into the language of film that dogged his later screenwriting career was already a problem. This Side of Paradise was never adapted into a full-length film, the only Fitzgerald novel not to appear on the big screen. Sometime in mid-1923, Scott began work on his third novel. Despite earning a decent living, Fitzgerald's progress was obstructed by his constant need to grind out short fiction to pay the bills. With his residence in Great Neck and proximity to New York City, the writer was also frequently distracted by socializing with other literary figures, A-list movie stars like Gloria Swanson, and outings to New York City with Zelda, which were invariably expensive, the couple never scrimping on a good time. Despite the steady stream of magazine sales, Fitzgerald remained in constant debt, routinely exceeding his own specific household budgets monthly by thousands of dollars. And rather than a supportive spouse who organized the household, Zelda contributed to the chaos and financial extravagance that became a major distraction during Scott's career. Typically, to allow Fitzgerald to really focus on what he believed would be his most important work, he made the decision to head to Europe, specifically the French Riviera. At the time, this was not the absurd economic proposition that it would be today. The dollar was remarkably strong against the French franc, and living costs compared to New York were remarkably inexpensive. In May 1924, they sailed for France. Fitzgerald had managed to save about $7,000, which he intended to use to finance the trip. In the early 20s, the Riviera was not considered fashionable in the summer, but the Fitzgeralds, despite their vow to be more economically practical, rented a spectacular property, the Villa Marie above San Rafael. With a nanny for their daughter, nicknamed Scotty, and a cook and maid, they were not exactly slumming it. Although completely absorbed in his work, Fitzgerald and his wife did venture out to socialize in the nearby coastal village. Possibly out of boredom, Zelda began a flirtation with a local French naval officer, Edouard Jossin. This generated all kinds of drama between Zelda and Scott, most likely the attention she was seeking. And while Jossin eventually denied that any real intimacy occurred, the incident underlined the permanent tension within the marriage, the feeling that the relationship was a powder keg that could explode at any minute. Despite this turmoil, Fitzgerald remained committed to his work with remarkable expectations for his current project, writing to a friend upon arrival in France, "Well, I shall write a novel better than any novel ever written in America." Despite this commitment, the Fitzgeralds mingled with other American expats, most notably Gerald and Sarah Murphy, formerly from New York. Gerald, the son of the head of the Mark Cross leather goods retailer, and Sarah, the daughter of Frank Wyborg, a successful ink manufacturer and real estate investor who owned vast tracts of land in the U.S., including 600 acres in East Hampton, Long Island. While Gerald had some modest income from his own investments made while working at his father's company, Sarah had received a sizable trust fund, and the couple fled the mundane work world, living in splendor in Paris and Cap d'Antibes. They are said to have originated the phrase, "living well is the best revenge." When they met the Fitzgeralds, the Murphys were in the process of renovating a home in Cap d'Antibes. In the meantime, they were staying at the ultra-chic Hotel du Cap. The Murphys were known both in Paris and the Riviera as generous and charming, and the Fitzgeralds spent a great deal of time with them, although Gerald and Sarah were put off by Fitzgerald's behavior while excessively drinking. Gerald's main output were paintings in a modernist style. Today, some of his works hang in the Whitney and Metropolitan Art Museums, among other places. Despite such social involvement, by September, Fitzgerald informed Max Perkins that he would be able to send off a finished copy of his novel by October 1st. Fitzgerald also informed Perkins of a young unknown American writer currently residing in Paris, named Ernest Hemingway. Although Fitzgerald had never met Hemingway, he was informed by some Parisian contacts of the young writer's promise based on a recently published collection of short pieces entitled In Our Time. So obscure with a limited release, it took Perkins several months to contact Hemingway, the editor unable to even get a hold of the writer's recent publication. Eventually, Perkins was able to obtain In Our Time, contacted the author, Hemingway eventually meeting with Perkins personally about becoming contracted to Scribner's. The Fitzgeralds eventually decided to move to Rome in late October, anticipating a lengthy period of galley revisions for the new novel. The $7,000 initial stake was now gone. Scott once again forced to produce short material to generate cash. Discouraged by this prospect, frequently engaging in heated arguments with Zelda and physically ill, he was excited by a November 20th letter from Max Perkins, who was practically congratulatory in his praise for Fitzgerald's latest novel. Although Scott considered several titles while composing the book, including Among Ash Heaps and Millionaires, Trimalchio and West Egg, and The High-Bouncing Lover, both Perkins and Zelda convinced him to use the alliterative The Great Gatsby. The rest of the winter was spent putting the final touches on this work, with Zelda battling various maladies, but also giving her husband crucial advice on changes to the manuscript, feedback that, despite their now frequent personality conflicts, he respected as essential. For those who knew anything about Scott's personal life, the unforgettable characters portrayed in the novel, like Daisy and Tom Buchanan, were undoubtedly scathing depictions of Ginevra King and her eventual husband, Bill Mitchell. Fitzgerald also revisited his negative attitudes about the very wealthy, their shallow and selfish worldview, a fundamental theme. Fitzgerald disliked Rome and was not fond of Italians, a perspective that prompted their eventual move to the five-star Hotel Tiberio on the island of Capri, quieter and hopefully less damp. Although attempts were made to sell serialization rights to The Great Gatsby to several magazines, the top publications turned it down based on its, for the time period, racy material. Both Fitzgerald and Perkins were eager to get the book out, and serialization would delay this process by several months, a delay that Scott and Perkins did not want to pursue, and any further attempts at a magazine pre-publication were abandoned, an unfortunate missed payday. The Great Gatsby was released on April 10, 1925. Having left Capri, the Fitzgeralds were in Paris, where Scott, practically obsessive over the book's reception, cabled Perkins only a day later on April 11th, looking for any feedback. The editor waited for a week and a half before cabling back the news that while reviews were very positive, sales were marginal. It was August before the first printing of 21,000 sold out, and the 3,000 second edition was ordered. This edition would remain partially unsold until Fitzgerald's death over a decade later. Scott was quite disappointed, sending Perkins a letter soon after publication stating that he would try one more novel, and if that still financially required the hack work of short magazine pieces, he would quit and go to Hollywood. The royalties paid on The Great Gatsby just barely paid back advance loans Fitzgerald had taken out from Scribner's, a total of about $6,000. Even more frustrating were the universally positive reviews that the book received from the literary community, an acknowledgement that this was Fitzgerald's best work and a great leap forward from his previous efforts. The author had a sense that the book was too sophisticated and advanced for contemporary public taste, but understood that there never will be a line at the bank for those who are artistically ahead of their time. The Fitzgeralds stayed in Paris in the spring of 1925. The city was already developing a reputation as an expatriate literary scene, and now that he was free of the obligation of composing Gatsby, Scott resolved to integrate himself into this community. He also was determined to make the acquaintance of Ernest Hemingway. This remarkable meeting of two American literary giants occurred for the first time on May 1st, 1925, at the Dingo Bar in Montparnasse on the Rue de l'Ombre, today an Italian restaurant. Unfortunately, most of the accounts of Fitzgerald's interactions with Hemingway came from the latter's perspective, an always suspect source, and in this case especially so. In Hemingway's posthumous account of his life and times in 1920s Paris, entitled A Movable Feast, he devotes some very specific attention to Fitzgerald, depicting him as an alcoholic, quirky to the point of immaturity, irritatingly irresponsible, and even emasculated by his wife. But Hemingway did respect Fitzgerald's talent writing after reading The Great Gatsby. When I had finished the book, I knew that no matter what Scott did or how he behaved, I must know it was like a sickness and be of any help I could to him and try to be a good friend. Unfortunately, Hemingway disliked Zelda Fitzgerald on sight, eventually telling Scott openly that she was mentally unstable, jealous of him, and even that she deliberately involved him in drunken binges to interfere with his work. The feeling was certainly mutual, with Zelda fundamentally believing that Hemingway's whole macho persona was a facade, and his talent was minimal. Despite her outspoken opinion on the subject, Fitzgerald remained extremely enthusiastic about Hemingway and continued to interact with him, usually without Zelda. In late 1925, early 1926, Fitzgerald did produce a novelette entitled The Rich Boy, during a time period he also described as 1,000 parties and no work. Upon the story's publication in Red Book, Fitzgerald would then begin assembling another collection of short stories, his third, The Rich Boy included, for publication later in 1926. Entitled All the Sad Young Men, it was Scott's only real meaningful publication for the entire year. The Rich Boy did contain one of Fitzgerald's most famous quotations. "Let me tell you about the very rich. They are different from you and me." While these lines are frequently cited as if Fitzgerald was placing the wealthy on a pedestal, he concludes the passage by stating, "Even when they enter deep into our world or sink below us, they still think they are better than we are." The novelette again explored Fitzgerald's perspective on the very wealthy and how the promise of money and the freedom it provided was usually wasted and the individual personally corrupted. Fitzgerald was able to successfully ingratiate himself into the Parisian literati set, the inevitable introduction to Gertrude Stein, orchestrated by Hemingway. Although Stein was quite complimentary, calling Fitzgerald the most promising American writer and referring to The Great Gatsby as a good book, Scott did not become part of her salon or even an avid follower of her perspective. The Fitzgeralds did head back to the Riviera in August of 1925, staying at the Hotel du Cap and spending a lot of time with the Gerald Murphys and the various other celebrities who passed through the region throughout the summer. Although Fitzgerald put some thought into the subject and composition of his next novel, he basically spun his wheels, not getting much done well into the new year. While he probably should have been more concerned about his own career, he involved himself in the machinations that got Hemingway out of a contract with a second-rate publisher and into the hands of Scribners and Max Perkins, who purchased the rights to Hemingway's recently finished first novel, The Sun Also Rises, as well as a lesser work, The Torrents of Spring, sight unseen, mostly at Fitzgerald's behest. 1926 set up as a potentially productive year for Scott as he received rights payments for both the film and stage version of Gatsby without having to provide any input, sums that totaled over $25,000 pre-Harold Ober commission. The 1926 silent film was permanently lost, so it is impossible to compare it to other later screen versions. Once again, Scott and Zelda decided to head for the Riviera in March, hoping to duplicate the creativity of their previous visit when The Great Gatsby was written. Needless to say, they rented first one expensive property near Cap d'Antibes and then another even more luxurious when the first did not suit them. The Gerald Murphys had practically staked out a relatively deserted stretch of beach known as the Plage de la Garoupe. The couple originating the practice of sunbathing and relaxing on the beach, something that was previously unheard of among the locals. Hemingway, Dorothy Parker, and Robert Benchley were among the notables that the Fitzgeralds mingled with over the course of the summer. Despite Hemingway subsequently denying it, Scott and Ernest spent a great deal of time discussing The Sun Also Rises, Fitzgerald even supplying a 10-page outline of suggested changes. Scott continued to procrastinate when it came to working on his own novel, although he claimed to Harold Ober that it was 25% finished. In truth, it was still a jumble of disorganized characters and plot lines. For the first time, his drinking interfered with his work habits, the summer passing by without any significant literary progress. The drunken behavior of both Fitzgeralds also began to alienate their formerly close friends, the Murphys. Scott resorted to childish drunken antics like tossing hotel lounge ashtrays into the air and throwing pieces of fruit at stylish dinner parties at the Murphys' spectacularly renovated home, the Villa America. Most likely, this is why the Fitzgeralds did not go with Hemingway and the Murphys on their annual sojourn to the bullfighting festival in Pamplona. Zelda also became problematic. Verbal fights with her husband could break out at a moment's notice, frequently over a petty matter. Sarah Murphy actually took it upon herself to write a lengthy letter to Zelda, telling her for the foreseeable future, based on especially Scott's behavior, they were persona non grata at the Villa America. This only a year after Gerald Murphy had sent them a heartfelt letter telling them how after their departure in 1925, the Murphys already missed them and the wonderful times they had shared. A fundamental problem was the attention that the Murphys and others were now paying to Hemingway, a development that could only upset Fitzgerald, professionally insecure and always striving to be the center of attention and the life of the party. To most observers, it seemed that in this regard, the Fitzgeralds were always trying too hard to the point of annoyance. Scott hoped that the end of the summer season and its celebrity and social distractions would allow him to get back to work. It didn't happen. With December and the onset of winter, the Fitzgeralds decided to head back to the States, their health impacted by their excessive drinking and their marriage frayed. Again, hoping that a change of scenery would allow him to shake his creative malaise, Scott accepted an offer from United Artists to come to California to work on a film script, a comedy. Early 1927 found the couple at Los Angeles' posh Ambassador Hotel, Fitzgerald to be paid a guaranteed $3,500 and an additional $12,500 when the script was accepted. They left their daughter with Scott's parents, who had relocated to Washington, D.C. Fitzgerald was eager to shine. Hollywood already had a reputation for throwing easy money at writers who could adapt to the film industry's esoteric style. But this potentially career-altering endeavor only lasted 2 months. Scott's plotline about an incarcerated female who possesses a lipstick that makes every man want to kiss her was too shallow even by Hollywood standards, and he didn't get along with Constance Talmadge, the star of the film. His script was not accepted, and the chance at some fast money, as well as a positive reputation in the film colony, quickly went out the window. Typically, the Fitzgeralds racked up bills which exceeded the initial $3,500 advance, and Scott's flirtation with an 18-year-old ingenue did little to improve his domestic situation. When Zelda gave him a hard time over this infatuation, he responded by saying that he couldn't help being attracted to women who made something of their talent through focus and discipline, only adding fuel to the fire. Their fighting continued on the long train ride to the East Coast, Zelda becoming so angry at one point that she tossed her platinum wristwatch, the first substantial material item Scott gave her in 1920, out of a railroad car window. Probably realizing that New York would not be a good place to relaunch a surge of creative energy, Scott and Zelda decided to find a place to live in Wilmington, Delaware. Predictably, they leased a large mansion for 2 years, although the rent was cheap at only $150 a month. The veritable isolation initially even sparked Zelda to get some work done. She composed and sold several short pieces to publications like Harper's Bazaar and the Smart Set, although these publications all insisted that the byline read by F. Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald. She also began to seriously resume ballet lessons, a passion from earlier years, tutored 3 times a week by the director of the Philadelphia Opera Ballet, her daughter Scotty accompanying her to Philadelphia for these sessions. Although her literary output fizzled after these few sales, ballet dancing and her desire to actually perform as a serious professional ballet dancer became an obsessive pursuit. While Fitzgerald isolated himself in a sparsely furnished upstairs back room, he still remained stifled as far as his next novel. He then resorted to spending much of his time on short pieces, mostly out of financial necessity. Losing interest in Delaware and the occasional trip to New York City, the summer of 1928 found the Fitzgeralds back in Paris, Scott hoping to get re-inspired, and Zelda intent on studying with Lyubov Igorova, a former prominent Russian ballerina, now a retired teacher. Luckily, Fitzgerald was able to finance this excursion with a series of short pieces about an individual named Basil Duke Lee, from childhood through college years at Yale, an introspective semi-autobiographical journey published in the Saturday Evening Post, both popular and lucrative, generating over $30,000. However, this effort and the inevitable socializing with such famous figures as bookstore owner and publisher Sylvia Beach and James Joyce precluded any progress on the novel. Despite numerous updates and promises that he was making progress, Scott, with Zelda, returned to the U.S. in October 1928, the manuscript remaining unfinished. Thank you for listening to part 1 of this podcast about F. Scott Fitzgerald. Information for this podcast came from the books Some Sort of Epic Grandeur by Matthew Broccoli, Paradise Lost, A Life of F. Scott Fitzgerald by David S. Brown, and Crazy Sundays by Aaron Latham. There are also additional photographs, bibliographical, and musical information at bitesizebiographies.com. Thank you for listening, and please tell a friend about Bite-Sized Biographies.